Welcome. Today we're going to talk about digital twins and synthetic control arms, how to use synthetic data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to optimize study design. I'm Paul Chu, the Chief Medical Officer for FESI. I'd like to introduce Michelangelo Baroni, who is the Clinical Science Director at Alpha Sigma. Michelangelo.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for having me. Thank you.
Next, we have Peter O'Neill, who is the Senior Director of Clinical Operations at Insight. Peter?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you. Melissa Price is Senior Vice President of Oncology Emerging Products at Bluebird Bio. Melissa.
Thanks for the invitation to join you guys. This is going to be an exciting discussion.
So let's just get started. Michelangelo, many in our audience probably are not aware of what synthetic control arms are and how they might be useful. Could you explain what they are?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Paul, for such an interesting question. To try really to find an answer to that kind of question, I think that we need to put in such kind of question in the context of the randomized clinical trials. So everybody knows that randomized clinical trials comprises of, let's say, an arm where patients are supposed to be randomized to a specific treatment to be tested, to be compared versus a comparator, which may be a placebo, where there is no specific treatment already established for the specific disease or even a well-established standard of care. So in that kind of context, instead of having patients to be randomized in the context of clinical trials and dealing with the burden of clinical trials, then those data which are supposed to be generated from the participation of the patients in the comparator arm, those data are coming from what is called synthetic arm, meaning that these data are usually generated from historical data available coming from both clinical trials carried out on a similar population and in a specific disease, or even from electronic medical records. So basically, this might simplify, the overall framework related to the specific clinical trials to be carried out, even addressing the long-standing questions or ethical questions related to the participation of patients to, for example, clinical trials where placebo is usually used or where there is already a well-structured standard of care available for the specific treatment. So basically, synthetic arm is constructed from well-matched weighted combination of non-treated groups, allowing for a statistical estimation of an intervention effect to what would that happen to the intervention if it had not received such kind of intervention. So this kind of approach would somehow, as I mentioned before, let's say, simplify the overall implementation of the clinical trials, putting the patients in the center of that kind of aspect.
Thank you, Michelangelo. So it sounds like a synthetic control arm should be considered because it can simplify the trial, it can help patients, and also has a rigorous statistical basis on how it can be generated. Now, Peter, can you compare and contrast the randomized control arm versus the synthetic control arm, which Michelangelo has just framed?
Sure, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. So randomized control trials are the gold standard for clinical trials. But there's some downsides for certain diseases or rare diseases. It may be difficult to find enough patients to fill a clinical trial. For certain diseases like oncology, there may be concerns about patients receiving placebos or receiving standard treatments that maybe don't have much upside. So we do a lot of trials in the industry in oncology, and a lot of times patients want to be in a clinical trial where they have the chance to receive a investigational drug, and some patients don't want to be in a trial where they could potentially receive a placebo. So I think the randomized controlled trials will remain the gold standard from a regulatory perspective, but in cases where they're not feasible, or where they may just take too long, or where there's a real need for the patients to get the drug to market. I think that there's an opportunity to use historical data, real world data, to inform the decisions of the drug development process, and also to, from a statistical standpoint, to reduce the number of patients that you need to have in the clinical trial.
Thanks, Peter. I think that really puts a nice frame around how we might use synthetic control arms. But there are not only synthetic control arms, but there is also a concept now of the digital twin. Could you explain, Melissa, what a digital twin is?
Sure. Thanks for having me. When I think about a digital twin, I think there's some similarities to the synthetic cohort in the sense that you use real world data to generate virtual patients, basically. But to me, the distinction is really the application of that data. So in the synthetic control scenario, we're really talking about a regulatory environment, using this for a randomized controlled trial, for example. Whereas I think with the digital twin, maybe a little bit less rigor, but you also use it in for different aspects of your trial. So you might use it when you're planning your study to understand, let's say, the toxicity profile of patients that match your eligibility criteria, to sort of understand what your benchmark is for success, as an example. Another thing that comes to mind is, in oncology, we often do small phase 1 studies that, while certainly the primary endpoint is always safety, you're always looking for a little signal of efficacy. And it's sometimes hard to get that signal when you have such a small number of patients, and especially in a dose escalation cohort where you have very, very small patients at each dose level. And so in my mind, a digital twin can kind of help give you at least some direction about whether you are seeing the signal that you're looking for, and can help maybe guide investment decisions about whether you want to move forward with that asset or not, and can potentially then avoid unnecessary spend and treating patients with a suboptimal therapy.
Thanks, Melissa. The audience should know that a digital twin concept, or a synthetic control concept, has been used in other non-clinical settings. A synthetic control was used by Abadi and others to show the cost to the West German economy in 1990 going forward when they integrated East Germany. The real data on the left shows the solid line of West German economic growth, and the dotted line shows the other European countries in the post-war period where German growth was consistently greater than its peers. But in 1990, you can see that there was a dip because of the costs of the integration of the two countries. Now, the right graph shows Abadi's dotted counterfactual growth of West Germany. He used a synthetic West Germany and what the West German economy would have done if it had not gotten the treatment, so to speak, the integration. With the mathematics, they were able to show the consistency and other validation measures to show that this was a reasonable prediction of growth that they did not have. So it's a synthetic control at a country level, but very much the same principle. Now, the other issue is this all theory, or is this actually real and practical? So Michelangelo, have synthetic controlled trials using real world evidence been used successfully with FDA?
I think this is the key question. And I think that we need to make it clear that we are not only talking conceptually, but it's something that has been already applied somehow. So it's not something to come that can be considered, in the perspective. But it's something that we have to be aware that is, let's say, as a part of the different, let's say, the armamentarium or the different approaches that the different key stakeholders, from regulators, sponsors, sites, and patients, might be aware that they can be used in order really to, answer to the specific question related to the specific treatment effect. So to answer to your question, yes, I think that since 2010, real-world evidences has already supported FDA decision-making in more than 22, let's say, products. which are, let's say, spreading from rare diseases. I think 10 products have been, let's say, analyzed and approved based on the data coming from synthetic harm implementation, or 7 products in oncology, 4 products in emergency treatment, and even 1 product as an adjunctive treatment for patients in schizophrenia. So I think that starting from the perspective, as also Peter was highlighting before, that still a randomized controlled trial approach is the gold standard. I think that we have to be aware that we might have additional options and approaches to be used and to be identified in the context of the need that we really have, and try to identify if the synthetic harm applied in the specific area might be useful for us and for the key stakeholder to address specific questions.
Well, thanks, Michelangelo. I think what you just said is that this synthetic data has real-world applications and has supported decision-making with regulatory authorities. And there are several guidances now from Health Canada, from PMDA, Japan, and also in Europe, that real-world evidence and innovative trial designs will be considered in their regulatory decision-making. But beyond the digital twin or synthetic controls for registrational purposes, you mentioned a little bit, Melissa, on other potential uses and benefits of using this approach. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I mentioned a couple examples of where digital twins in particular might be used differently, in a non-regulatory environment, synthetic controls. But I think there's also, in addition to randomized controlled studies, from a regulatory perspective, there's other opportunities. So, to satisfy post-marketing requirements, for example, to build a prospective set of controlled data from a long-term patient disease registry to be used in future designs. To support expanded labels, supplemental indications. So those are some of the examples. I think really the world is sort of your oyster. And I think for me, one of the big challenges is to be able to craft a well-defined hypothesis for which you can then generate the data to support, as opposed to sort of going on a fishing expedition, because it's harder to know what you're looking for in that case. And so I think we're just sort of starting to scratch the surface on how do we define what those questions are so that we can really answer them in the best way based on the lots and lots and lots of data that's out there now.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. And Peter, and can you also expand on what was mentioned briefly? I think you mentioned it, and Michelangelo mentioned it, is beyond how pharma can benefit. We've talked a lot about how pharma can benefit from synthetic controls. How can potentially patients benefit from this change in the paradigm of how we develop products?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's the key question there. That's why we do these trials, are for the patients. So how can we make our trials better for patients? I think that's a question that we all have to ask. How can we bring medicines to patients faster? How can we identify targets better? As Melissa said, I think there's a use for this, not just in registration, but early on, making sure that we have good data so we can identify compounds that we think are going to be active, and not spend so much time on compounds that don't have as much promise. So the more data that we have, and now that there's so much data out there, the more data that we have to compare, the better decision making we can make early in drug development, and then put all of our resources into late phase trials in the best candidate drugs. So from a patient perspective, patients, they have a need, and it's our obligation to meet that need as fast as we can. So if there's a way that we can use real world data or synthetic data or prior cohorts to reduce the number of patients that need to be in a clinical trial, and reduce the number of patients that need to potentially be on placebo, and then bring a drug to market faster for those patients, I think that's really our ethical obligation, I think.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, Peter. So from what I'm hearing, there are many benefits associated with synthetic control arms and potentially digital twins. One, there's the potential to accelerate drug development, lower costs, faster time to market. 2, the ability of precision diagnostics. Let's not forget that this is the age of precision medicine. So with precision diagnostics and oncology and rare diseases, we can even hone down for a more precise choice of patients for a synthetic control arm, say those with a certain mutation. Patients can benefit, smarter trials, faster cures, making treatments accessible. And also, the regulatory processes appear to be adapting to these programs where real-world evidence and synthetic controls are sufficient for approval. As Michelangelo mentioned, over 20 products in the last 11 years. Now, Peter, we don't want to give the impression to the audience that everything is sweetness and light when it comes to synthetic controls, replacing everything all the time. What are the challenges, do you think, for the adoption of synthetic controls and digital twins?
Well, I think it's hard to do anything innovative. There's always has to be the people who try it first. When it's something like synthetic controls or synthetic data or things that people don't necessarily know a lot about upfront, I think there's a little bit of consensus building that we all have to do in the industry. But you can see from the discussion today, there's, I think, a natural, we naturally just jump to the end game, which would be, wouldn't it be great to have a synthetic control arm in a registration trial? But it's not, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I think there's going to be many years where we as an industry are using these great data sets that we have, whether it's real world data or prior cohorts from other clinical trials, to do more of a stepwise approach. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a synthetic control arm. We can use data from prior trials in a synthetic control just to compare against, our phase 1 and phase 2 data, or just to help make better decisions early on in development. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I think after more and more companies are using it and the regulators are seeing it more and using it for more and more approvals, then ultimately we'll be able to get to a place where maybe in some rare diseases we could see synthetic control arms replace a full double-blind randomized control trial, or at least drastically reduce the number of patients that need to be on the control arm.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you very much, Peter. Any other thoughts, Michelangelo?
I would like to echo what Peter somehow has just raised. I think that, let's see, I would agree in looking at the synthetic arm to be implemented as a stepwise approach. I think one of the challenges might be that we might consider in using such kind of approach, or even overusing such kind of approach, which is probably not the best approach to be implemented, because we have also really to consider that as implementing such kind of approach, that would require really to have impact on how to translate such kind of approach on the trial execution. So we need to embed such kind of approach in our common operating model, which might require, for example, for sure, change management from our clinical operation team and how to deal with such kind of trials where synthetic arm are going to be used. I think that would even require also cultural change from sponsor side and also from regulator side. But always starting from the perspective that such kind of options, less solution, cannot be implemented 100% to each and every, let's say, clinical trial, so situation that we are to deal with. It's something that we have to choose consciously, of course, coming from an open discussion with the regulators and with the key experts in even the therapeutic area, and to consciously decide that the kind of approach might be their approach to address the specific question we are raising.
Yes, that it's very interactive, very stepwise, being very careful, I think is what I'm hearing, Michelangelo.
Yeah.
Melissa, any thoughts for this?
Yeah, Michelangelo referred to change management, and I think that is an important component here. And to sort of tie into one of my previous comments about being able to clearly define a hypothesis, I think that goes a long way, because I think with change management, what's often seen as resistance is really a lack of clarity. And so I think we need to basically educate each other on what this looks like to provide that clarity and have those well-defined hypotheses, and learn about what from each other, like we're doing today, to really give that clarity, which I think will lower the resistance for adoption of any new innovation. But this is no exception there, I guess.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. We've had an extremely unusual year and a half, and it's not over, which is the COVID pandemic, and how it's affected how trials are conducted. The FDA has issued guidance on how to do these centralized trials. So what does COVID do, Peter, in terms of synthetic control arms? I mean, is there a potential benefit there?
Well, I think what we've learned from the pandemic is that as an industry, we can really come together and do great things. We saw that with the vaccines that were developed really quickly. But what we also saw was dozens and dozens of companies all trying to do trials in the same small group of patients at the same time. And there weren't enough patients to contribute to all the trials. So I think there was the opportunity, I think. We weren't quite prepared, I think, to roll out a bunch of synthetic control trials at the beginning of the pandemic. But it's this type of situation where you don't have enough patients for all the different trials. And if we were a little better prepared as an industry from a synthetic control perspective, we probably would have had more companies that explored the option of synthetic controls. But as we saw, we didn't see a whole lot of that, because I just think we're not quite there as an industry yet where companies are comfortable just rolling that out. So I think we learned that there's in a situation like a pandemic, there's not a lot of patients, but there's a lot of scientific research that we want to do. And in the future, that would be a good opportunity for synthetic controls if we can get to that point as an industry.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Michelangelo, what about COVID and synthetic controls? Are we mixing things up? Is there a benefit? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that probably an emergency like the COVID-19 that we have been living probably is not the main area of implementation of such kind of concept. Because that the emergencies like COVID, let's say, they are requiring a specific, let's say, approaches, trying really to release a specific answer to the specific question in a very short time frame. So and then the level of reliability on those kind of data to be generated must be very, very high, because it needs to be implemented in the context of a worldwide, plan. But having said that, I would say that the implementation of the synthetic arm might bring for sure secondary benefits, regardless of the approach of the area that where we wanna let's say implement such kind of approach. And all these approaches are going towards the same direction in order to make linear, easier and more streamlined the framework of the clinical trials that we are going to run. If you think about the patient burden, as we name it in our previous discussion, or even the investigator burden related to clinical trials, which would require a high number of patients to be enrolled in the clinical trials, or even the high number of the visits to be managed at the site level. All these aspects are somehow increasing the complexity of the trials overall, and the kind of effort which is required by both the patients and the sites and the investigators. So I think that if we want to put all these kind of things all together and having as a additional aim in using such kind of approach in making linear and more effective the overall framework of the clinical trials, I think this is another, let's say, perspective on how to use synthetic arms.
Yeah, no, what I hear you and Peter saying basically is that sometimes it's very hard to find patients, whether you have a pandemic or not. And maybe if you have a rich clinical database where this sort of arm or digital twin can be constructed reasonably and reliably, that would be a good alternative, independent of an emergency. But it was a secondary benefit of COVID. Melissa, what Michelangelo had brought up for the 22 approvals in the last 11 years is rare diseases, oncology, mainly. Is synthetic control arms of digital twins only restricted, do you think, to the areas of oncology or rare diseases?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we start there because those rare disease and oncology share a couple common phenotypes, which is a relatively rare, hard to find population, but also the life-threatening nature of those diseases. And I think those are the ones that sort of are the lowest hanging fruit. But certainly those characteristics are not restricted just to rare diseases and oncology. So I think there are other, subpopulations in other therapeutic areas that would certainly benefit from synthetic control arms. Having said that, I think, what I mentioned earlier about using digital twins outside of that construct of synthetic control arms, where, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's a life-threatening disease where you need to get away from a randomized controlled study, but you can use it to help inform your development planning, your protocol development, your decision-making after your phase 1 study. I think all of those opportunities sort of transcend the indication space.
Right. Peter, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Melissa makes a good point. We really need to consider it throughout the drug development life cycle. But I'd also say, if we're going to use synthetic controls in a scenario where it's not life-threatening, we may have situations where we have diseases that are just well-known and treatments that are well-known, and there's a lot of real-world data on those treatments. So even if it's not a life-threatening disease, if we have volumes and volumes of well-organized data at institutions all over the world for a set of patients or treatments, we should be trying to use that data to speed the development of new therapies. So I think that's a situation where it doesn't have to be a life-threatening disease or a rare disease. It could just be a disease that is well known or well categorized. And I think that's in the future, that's another scenario where we could use that real world data to inform our decisions or even as a synthetic control arm to help speed development of a new therapy for patients who have been maybe using the same therapy with varying effects for a long time. And there's a lot of data on it.
Thanks, Peter. And so the role for synthetic data generated by rigorous statistical sampling can create a simulation scenario and models where these data can be used to supplement or to replace a control arm. And it's data taken from the real world. These are where we model patient populations, define the boundaries of the trial, optimize the design, and positively impact operational success for the trials that go forward, but preserve resources for projects that may be terminated earlier. It doesn't make the decision, but it informs the decision. And can minimize or replace a control arm of a trial, of course, with regulatory guidance, reducing the demand for patient recruitment, saving time and money, mitigating the ethical issues, which Peter brought up, around patients receiving placebos. Well, thanks again, everyone, for participating in this panel discussion. Very stimulating, lots of work to do. For the audience, there's more information in a white paper that's been published by Michelangelo, Fezai, and Accenture at our website, fezai.com. Thanks again, everyone.